Hello everyone. To start off this sketch today, we're going to do a quick warm-up. These are the pencils I'm going to be using. This is your HB, it's a normal sketching pencil, you should have these at home. A 2B, this is a really great all-round sketching pencil, one of my favourites to use. And this is a 5B, it's a really soft graphite pencil and I'm going to be using it today to get my darkest tones. So to start off, I'm going to practice some ellipses as we're going to be seeing these a lot in our drawings. I'm going to gradually increase in pressure as I go down. Then I'm going to practice some lines. These are going to start from very light to very dark. It's important to get a couple of practice lines in just to get the feeling in your arm and your wrist. Now I'm going to create a tonal bar using a crosshatch shading method. So I'm just going to speed this up a bit. I'm going to start off by shading horizontally and starting off very light and then gradually building up pressure. Then I'm going to change the direction in which I'm shading by flipping my paper around. By overlapping shading in this way, you can get really smoothed over result, so you can't really see any of the scratchy pencil lines. So now I'm going to be using my 2B just to get those dark ends of my tonal scale. Try not to go too much over the light because the HB's done all that work. Just keeping up with those crosshatch shadings, keep changing direction, and then onto the 5B to get a really dark bit at the bottom. You should see how you can notice by now that where I've crosshatched my shading, it's quite smooth and you can't really tell the direction of line, so you don't get any of those scratchy pencil marks. If you don't have a 2B or a HB, or a 5B, a HB can shade actually quite dark, but it can be a little bit reflective and can look slightly more metallic, and it tends to damage the paper a bit more, but they are more than fine to use. And then finally, I'm just going to practice doing some nice flat edge sketching, practicing with the tip of my pencil and the flat edge. So that way I'm going to be really comfortable when I'm shading later. Right, so now I've got some print off pictures I'm going to choose from, just having a look at them all. I think this one looks best, so I'm going to go with that. Unfortunately, it's not the best quality. Right, so I've got a square on my page and I'm going to, first of all, lightly sketch the shape. So lightly, this is going to be really light. So just really light, messy lines. You can see how those ellipses and lines we drew earlier are really helpful. Now, as my arm and wrist can already remember the action to make when drawing these objects. So it seems to come quite naturally now. Just shaping that in there. As you can see, I've already kind of gone outside of my box a little bit. This is just because with any drawing, it kind of develops as you go along. It might be that what you intended isn't quite correct, and that's why I've gone on a really big piece of paper, so I can alter it as I go along. I find it's best to not really focus on any one object for too long and really just think about the bigger picture. So think about how are these objects overlapping, at what point do the lines intersect, what can you really see, and I know you can't quite see this, but I'm looking at my picture all the time just to make sure that I can get this correct. It helps to do a little bit of the background detail. It helps put your objects in their place, so don't forget about your backgrounds. Okay, and you can't quite see it, but all my lines are really nice and light. That's because nothing's permanent at this stage. It makes it really easy to alter those scribbly lines later. Right, now I'm going to lightly define my shapes. I've gone back to my picture and I'm using a pen to outline all the shapes I can see. This helps when it comes to drawing as you are taking the time to really look at your picture and really getting an idea of what shapes we can see. So I'm just doing like more of the basic shapes I can see, like those reflections, can see some glasses, marking out my shadows, just any lines I really want to start pulling out in my drawing. And this is all just the beginning steps. So it might seem a bit odd at first, especially drawing reflections, and that's why it really helps to mark out those shapes first so that you can see where they all are in your image. Okay, any lines that I'm really happy with that I got from my initial sketch, I'm just starting to darken them up just a little bit. This will help bring out some of the lines from my scribbly sketch earlier. I find that when you're drawing, you've got to build it up in layers. So the lines that you make at the start are no more than guidelines for what's going to come. So we're sort of slowly discovering an image. Each mark is going to bring new depth and definition to the picture. Okay, so now I've lightly defined my shapes, I'm now going to mark out my shadows. So I'm going to go back to my picture again, and probably best not to use pencil. Go back to the pen. If you don't have a pen, then try using either a different coloured pencil or maybe a biro, just something that's going to really stand out. So I'm marking out any area that I can see a shadow in my image, so any sort of dark areas that I might have missed before. I might slightly define more of my shapes. So I've got my HB pencil and I'm going to mark out some of those shadowy areas. Putting in little bits of definition wherever I can see it. Slowly darkening those lines that I'm happy with. I'm not really worrying too much about detail at this point. I'm just trying to get in like those shapes and those lines. It can still be quite messy at this point. Oh, this is a bit of a tip for anyone who does a lot of drawing, is your hand can quite often create a bit of a smudge from moving around all the graphite. So if you put a piece of plain paper under your hand when you are drawing, then that can really help not smudging, because I'm moving my hand all over the page at this point and I want to have quite a nice clean image when I'm finished. Right, so marking out all these shadows, I'm just applying a little bit more pressure than I was at the beginning, so it's all really nice and clear for me. Any shadowy areas, I'm just sort of marking them out roughly at this point. Not worrying about shading, so I'm all working with the very tip of my pencil at this point. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that basic sketch. So I feel like I've marked out all my shadows. It's important to do this before you do your light shading, because at least you can see where you're meant to be shading and sort of where you're meant to stop shading. So I'm going to get out a nice sharp HB pencil, and using my pencil on the flat of its side, so I'm using as much of the lead as possible, I am going to start some shading. So sped this up for you guys to watch. And we can see I'm doing a bit of crosshatch shading, so when I shade in one direction, I just kind of flip my arm or my page a little bit and shade in the other direction. Not worrying too much about being particularly neat at this point. We don't really need to be too neat until the end really, because I'm just marking out all the dark areas. And there is going to be quite a lot of shadow in this drawing when we're done. And if you want to get a really good still life image, then you are going to need a lot of shading and a lot of tonal depth. So again, you can see why those exercises we did at the start are really helpful at this point, because not only am I shading in little areas, I'm shading large areas, and I'm really comfortable with using my pencil now. It's kind of like we've had that warm up and now we're ready to go. Okay, right, so I've finished my light shading and now I'm going to define my dark areas. So for this, I'm going to swap out to my 2B pencil. Remember, if you don't have one at home, then just try working a little bit dark with your HB. And always looking at my picture, any area that seems to stand out as being quite dark, I'm going to start to pull them out again. So we can barely see any of our sketchy lines from earlier. This is exactly where we want to be. And now I'm kind of putting in new lines and redefining my objects because I've kind of got a little bit lost in all that sketchy madness. That quite often happens with shading. You can do a lot of shading, then you lose your shapes, so you've got to bring them back out again. A little bit of redefinition from your pencil. Okay, so that's all a little bit clearer. I feel like I've nicely defined my darker areas, and now I need to be deepening my tones by adding a bit more shading because we've only really got one tonal value at the moment on most of our shading. So we need a whole array of tonal values if we want this to look really nice in 3D. So don't forget to be crossing over your shading, doing a nice bit of crosshatch shading because that really kind of just makes those pencil marks not look so scratchy and obvious. Especially if any of you really like to get nice smooth drawings, this is a really good technique to perfect. Wasn't a huge fan of drawing that reflective glass with the spoon in it. So whilst you're shading, you want to be thinking about what areas of your image you can really start to pull out. So when you are adding dark tones like this, it's going to make those areas of your drawing really pop. So there are some areas that I really want to focus on so I can get that definition and make sure that they can be visible in my end result. Okay, so just working on some of those reflections there, like that glass mug with the spoon in. I can see that on both of my pots. Okay, right, so now we've built up a bit more shading and deepening our tones, we are now moving on to the darkest areas and fine detail. So for that, I'm going to get out my 5B. So we're now going to do our really darkest areas because we're not quite done yet. And this is where we can really sharpen up any of the edges. We can use the point of our pencils, really start to bring in some tonal fades like when we saw in our tonal bars. Just going to really help bring some depth into this. I like to think when you're shading, you're sort of pushing some areas back and bringing other ones forward. So I'm doing that here. There we go. If we add a bit of a shadow under this saucepan here, then it's going to really place it in the frame. It's all of a sudden it's got a shadow. Looks like it's sat on the surface. Could define some of those shines on the spoon. So at this point, we really can't see any of our initial lines. We're going over everything that we've already made for ourselves. It's all a uncovering process. Okay, just giving this glass a bit of attention. Again, it's at the forefront of my image, so it should be nice and clear. Making these lids really stand out. Okay, and then finally getting out your rubber, and you can neaten up any edges that you want to bring out, so like any extra shines or any mistakes that you might have made if you've gone a bit mad with the sketching like I have. And I think that's looking pretty good. Oh yeah, that bit was annoying me from the beginning. Okay, right, and I think that is finished.